Do you want to do the introduction, Megan?
It says it's setting up, so I'm just waiting to make sure.
Yeah, it says it's live, now streaming live.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to wait a couple seconds just to allow people to join the video. And while we're waiting for folks to join, I will add in the comments the link to the remote transcription services. And while we're waiting for folks to join, I will add. Okay, I have added the link for the transcription service in the comments below. So for those who want to have the transcription, that should be happening live. We'll also have closed captions that should be generated after this video is completed. So those should be available on the bottom if you're watching this after the fact. For those of you who are joining us now, either live or if you're watching this after the fact, welcome or welcome back. This is one of our series of videos that we're doing to answer live questions that parents have been bringing us, as well as share some information from previous questions or questions we've gotten offline about education during this time period. I am Megan Collins. I'm a staff attorney on the education team. I am here with Leslie Margolis, who is the managing attorney of the education team, as well as Tasha Marshall, our paralegal, and Susanna Barrios, an advocate tonight. And we are all with Disability Rights Maryland. And for those who don't know, we are the state's protection and advocacy, and we advocate on behalf of individuals with disabilities of all ages and all types of disabilities. But this webinar is specifically to address questions about special education. And so please feel free to leave us in the comments any questions you might have, and we will answer them live tonight. To start us off, while we wait for comments to come in, Leslie, do you want to go ahead and talk about attendance and how attendance is working during this time?
Sure, thanks, Megan. So we are becoming aware of some issues in jurisdictions throughout the state about how attendance is being monitored now that the school year has begun. And all the districts are looking at attendance very differently than they did in the spring, because now there's an expectation that that students will log on for about 3.5 hours a day of synchronous instruction, and then several hours a day of asynchronous instruction. So what we're hearing is that students, if they log in and attendance is taken, they're being considered to be present for the whole time period. Some districts are are taking attendance several times during the course of the day. Others may just count the child present for that whole synchronous time period if they're present at the beginning. And so the issue that we want to make, that we want to bring to your attention as parents, if you have a child who is not able to participate for that entire synchronous time period of 3.5 hours, you have a child who can sit still for 15 minutes and then is like, I'm done, I'm logging off. What we don't want is for the school to reflect that your child was there for the whole time when your child wasn't. So even if the school is logging that your child was in attendance, we always, every time we're doing these trainings, we're harping, nagging, suggesting that you keep your own records, that you keep data. How is your child doing? What's happening with the goals and objectives? But we're also suggesting that you just keep notes, logged in at 9:15, turn the computer off at 9:30, or whatever is going on with attendance, because when your child returns to school in the brick and mortar building, and it's time to look at, did your child get all the services he or she was supposed to get? Does your child have an entitlement to make-up services or need different services? It'd be really helpful to be able to go back and say, my child only got 2 hours a day instead of 6 hours a day, or 1 hour a day instead of 6 hours a day, and to have those records, because we think that teams are marking students present for times when they really may not be logged in. Another issue that's come up that we just learned about today in Anne Arundel County, for anybody who may be calling in or watching this from Anne Arundel, is related to attendance, and that's if your child is not able to participate in synchronous learning, the county has developed an alternative attendance policy that essentially makes you sign something that says that you are you understand and you're agreeing that your child will not get a free appropriate public education. We have grave concerns about this, and if you are in Anne Arundel County and you are faced with this, we would advise you to contact us or contact another advocate. This is a very problematic policy. So if you are working and your child is in daycare or with relatives who are not able to help your child log on, or if you have access issues in terms of technology, please contact us or contact an advocate. Do not sign this document or request this document for your signature. It's very problematic.
And I just thought of something when Leslie was finishing up there, and it's come up after a couple of our other trainings, and I should have thought to mention this at the beginning when I was doing the introduction, but I think it's worth noting Disability Rights Maryland, we are a nonprofit and we don't charge for our services. So in addition to these webinar trainings, which are obviously free and available to you on Facebook, we can provide free assistance via phone. If you contact us, we can give technical assistance. We may be able to offer additional case services, but whatever the service is that we're able to offer will be free. And so to the extent that we're able to help, we don't charge for our services. And I did want to mention that. And I have seen a couple questions coming in. So Tasha, I will throw it over to you to share those with us, but I do want to ask one of the people for clarification. There was a question, do kids that have IEPs need new vaccinations? And so before we answer that, can the person who commented that clarify for us, do you mean different vaccinations than kids normally needed for school, like a new COVID vaccine? What are you asking there? And then Tasha, if you want to pull another question.
Sure. So we have a viewer that wants to know about older children that should be getting transition services, and will there be a way to get those services after age 21, after they turn 21?
You want to take that one, Megan?
Sure. So for students who are transition aged, and really that means any student over the age of 14, the IEP team should be discussing what transition services or services necessary to assist the student in transitioning from school to post-secondary, whether that be post-secondary school, post-secondary employment, whatever services are necessary to make that transition should be provided to the student, whether that be pre-employment skills, whether it be academic skills to help them succeed in a post-secondary program, or whether it be life skills, communication skills. And so students with disabilities are entitled to those services beginning at age 14. And additionally, students with disabilities are entitled to compensatory education services to the extent that their regular IEP services aren't provided or services aren't provided in order for them to receive a free and appropriate public education. So if a student is entitled to transition services and doesn't receive them during this time or doesn't receive appropriate transition services during this time, then yes, students would be entitled to compensatory education. And the way that it works and what we've been advising in previous trainings is if you have a student who is near aging out because eligibility for special education does end at age 21, if you do have a student who's closer to aging out, we're suggesting that you reach out and contact us or another advocate for specific assistance because, like I said, that eligibility does end, but compensatory education is retroactive. And so to the extent that a student is eligible now, they should be able to receive compensatory education if those services aren't received during this time.
All right. So I'll go to the next question. We have a viewer who asked for more one-on-one instruction because e-learning is the better option, but that the OT, PT, and speech are being given in a group setting that doesn't work in person. And the question is, each triple setting will be counted as 3 presents, or can we ask later for reposition?
Okay, I'm not sure that I understand that question fully. I mean, I think that if distance learning is working well, that's great. If a student needs more one-to-one through distance learning, you would address that the same way that you would address it in person. You ask for an IEP meeting and raise your concerns about why your child needs whatever you're asking for in order to benefit from education. So again, if you have a concern about related services and the way they're being provided, you would want to explain to the IEP team why the way that services are being provided isn't working and why you're making the request that you're making. And the team has to provide what's called prior written notice if they don't agree with you and they choose not to give you what you're asking for. So if that doesn't answer your question, maybe you can be a little bit more specific. And I'm wondering if the question about vaccinations was clarified, because we can address that as well.
I do believe that question was clarified. Did you see it, Megan?
I did. They said they stopped vaccinations at age 4, and they are saying that they've heard they won't have to get COVID or flu vaccine this year. So to the extent that you have previously been able to receive an exemption with the school, I haven't heard anything. I don't know, Leslie, if you have. I haven't heard anything that will be any different this year.
I haven't, but I would assume that any information about that would be on the website for the Maryland State Department of Education, and that anybody who has questions about vaccinations and school reentry can go to the State Department of Education website. They have a COVID-related page, and so if they've updated the policy, I assume it would be there. And if not, they have a whole division that deals with school health services, and that would be the division to contact.
So we have a caller who has a 6-year-old that qualified to receive DDA services, but they don't have the services now, and they want to know, is there any services that the student can get in Maryland until she reaches services she can get until there is in Maryland. They said they don't have a budget to serve, I guess, a child her age 6. But she should be receiving services when she gets older. So DDA said that they don't have a budget to serve her, but that she should be getting services when she gets older. And the caller wants to know, are there any services that she can get in Maryland, I guess, until she gets old enough to receive the services that she could get through DDA?
That is a very good question, and that's a very tough situation if you're talking about services outside of the education system. DDA, the Developmental Disabilities Administration, should serve adults and children. Often what we hear from them is that they don't really serve children, though they certainly can. But they have limited funds, and they have they will often find children eligible and adults as well, and then they put them on a waiting list for services. So if your child's been found eligible, that's great. That's a good beginning. But they put people into categories based on their priority status. So unless it is a really critical situation, generally people will be on that waiting list for services for a long time. And once your child approaches 21, is in that latter part of transitioning, 18, 19, and you begin to think about what those services will look like, generally people will hang out on the waiting list. But that doesn't mean their status cannot change. For children who have autism, there is also the autism waiver, but that has also a very, very lengthy waiting list of years. So people who are currently getting services have been on the waiting list for maybe 8 or 9 years. So that also is not a great option for immediate services. So there aren't a lot of services, and the reality is that we often see families who end up relinquishing custody of their children when things really get extreme in order to access services through the Department of Social Services. Not something that we ever want to see, and if families are hitting that point or before they hit that point, we want to know, because that's work our office does to try to avert those placements. But that brings you back to the school system and what the school system is obligated to do, which is to provide a free, appropriate public education. And there's nothing that says that has to be a 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock school day. So if in order to make educational progress, which is kind of that standard, if a child needs more than that standard school day in order to make educational progress, it may be possible to get additional services through the school system. The same way that there's extended school year services, there are maybe the need for extended day services. It really depends on the individual needs of the student and what that student needs in order to be able to make meaningful educational progress.
All right, so we have a viewer who has a student who has returned to in-person school for 4 half-days per week. They have speech on the IEP 2 times per week, but the student's only receiving it 1 time per week. And they've been told that because they're half days, that's the reason that the student only getting speech 1 day per week. And should they still be providing the 2 sessions per the IEP? That's the question.
So I'll take this one. And I want to start by saying that as schools are reopening this fall, whether in person or virtual, there should be an IEP team meeting for each student to discuss what was provided in the spring, whether it was appropriate to meet the students' needs, how it can be adjusted to better meet the students' needs if it didn't meet the students' needs, or if it did, how the success the students saw could be incorporated this fall. Now, for students who are returning in person, I would say there is obviously a need for an additional discussion, as in this case, of how the difference in school day and how, a half school day will affect the student's ability to make progress on their IEP goals, whether all of their services, not just related services, but whether all the academic services can be provided. And it would need to be an individualized discussion, student by student, to the extent that that could be possible. I don't know, based on the comment, and maybe if you need this addressed, you can clarify for us, whether is it half a day in person and then half a day virtual? Is that 5th day? Is there some sort of virtual option? I mean, it would depend whether it's being used sort of as a hybrid model, or if it's just essentially a shortened school day programming, the extent that the student needs services in addition to that to meet their needs. And then the other question that you could raise with the team is, if your student is receiving on their per their IEP 2 days of speech per week, how long is each of those periods? And you could first, as I mentioned, do they both need to be in person? Could one be provided virtual if there just simply isn't enough in-person time to accomplish all of their goals and other IEP academic services and speech? And or could they have one longer session per week and still meet their needs? For some students, maybe that's appropriate, or maybe there's a reason it was split up to 2 times a week based on the student's need for reinforcement or something like that. It would really be an individualized discussion of why were there 2 separate sessions? Was it because each one was so lengthy? Was it to add reinforcement? Was it just based on the student's previous schedule? And then could it be provided now in either a longer session while the student's at school, one in person and one virtual? It's going to depend. Like Leslie said, a lot of this is based on the individual student's needs, but there should have been a meeting, or should still be a meeting with the school to discuss each and every student's transition back to learning this fall, whether it be in person or virtual. And if you've already had that meeting or feel you need another meeting, we'd recommend talking to the team about why that service was on your student's IEP to begin with, the importance of it, the importance of having 2 sessions, and how that same initial need can be met during this different way of instruction.
So we have a viewer who wants to know about wearing masks, and that Howard County says they have to wear a mask, and Anne Arundel says they don't. And the question is, who's right?
So districts may have mask policies, and that is fine. But there are students with disabilities who, for a variety of reasons, may not be able to wear masks, and there will be guidance forthcoming from the Division of Early Intervention and Special Education Services of the State Department of Education, making clear that wearing a mask cannot be a condition of return to school in person. So if there is a reason why a child with disabilities is unable to wear a mask, it could be their health condition, it could be behavioral, it could be, whatever it is, that cannot be a bar to their reentry to school. And I believe that that guidance will be coming out fairly soon. So cannot prohibit attendance.
Okay. The next viewer's question is, they have a new IEP that was written in July, and the services started when virtual learning began. And the case manager from the school contacted the parent to advise that the number of services that were written on the original plan would have to be cut in half due to distance learning and the lack of time. The question is that how services in virtual learning are being handled? And also they could not speak to the specific reading interventions that the student would receive. So she's waiting for directions from the board, wants to know who can or should she contact?
So this is something that I didn't mention in the last question I answered with regard to the speech services, and so I'll go ahead and mention now with regard to discussions that you have with the IEP team about the type of services that can be provided during this virtual learning period or hybrid model return back to school. Any discussion you have about services that the school is proposing to offer or services you request that the school is refusing to provide, the school should be creating a document after the IEP meeting called a notice of prior written notice that says what services were proposed or refused by the team. And it should document the service that was proposed or refused and the reason for proposal or refusal. And so in this case, I would say, did you receive the prior written notice after the meeting that said that they are only able to provide or cut the services in half because of the limited time provided? The other thing I would ask is whether they documented that they plan to provide compensatory education or plan to assess the effect that cutting the services in half had on your child following a return to school, because that's something that the team should be considering. And then with regard to the reading intervention and the team's position that they're waiting for directions from the board, I'm gonna toss it over to Leslie to address that part.
So ordinarily, the particular interventions used are not something that is included in the IEP, and the district has some leeway about how the methodology that they use. But if methodologies have been tried and have not been successful, it's okay for a team to specify a methodology to be used with a student. And I don't know if that's been the case. If an IEP contains a methodology and now in distance learning, they're refusing to do that methodology, then the team needs to explain why it's not possible to implement that methodology through distance learning. Anything that's on an IEP, the regular IEP, that is not possible to implement through distance learning needs to be, there needs to be an explanation of why it's not possible, why that IEP needs to be amended. And that amendment process can happen outside of an IEP meeting if you agree. And if you don't agree, then there needs to be an IEP meeting, and that documentation needs to be provided to you, and you have a right to challenge it.
And then I saw, as we were answering, the person who raised a question said there wasn't a meeting, it was just a phone call. And so since this information about the provision of services was given to you over the phone, our advice would be to request a meeting with the IEP team to discuss, as I was saying before, the reason that these services are necessary for your student and the impact that it will have on them if they're not provided. And then following that meeting, to request the prior written notice documenting the team's decision about the provision of services. It's possible that the team might change their mind after having a discussion. It's possible you might be able to ask that they use some creative solutions. I know we've talked in districts that are doing 4 days of instruction and then a day for teacher planning, or like almost remediation or review for students who have a technical difficulty and can't join or need additional intervention. In some cases, we've seen districts use that day. So it's possible at a meeting you could ask a team to consider options like that and to be able to provide a little more than half the services, or maybe even all the services, by working in some of those times. Although, I want to be cognizant of the fact that it is sometimes difficult to advocate once the school has made up their mind, particularly as a parent. And so I don't want to make it sound like that'll just be the easy answer. And if you are met with the same answer when you do meet with the school team, you can then, after the IEP meeting, ask for that prior written notice, at that point documenting what will be the team's decision. And if it isn't provided, then I would recommend you document in an email to the IEP chair, your request for it and documenting your understanding, and then you can contact us if you need more specific assistance after that. But the first step, if there hasn't been an IEP team meeting where that's been discussed, would be to request a meeting and to ask for that prior written notice to be provided.
Megan, there was a question about homeschooling and home and hospital teaching. Do you want to talk a little bit about the difference between homeschooling and home and hospital, and then a little bit about what the requirements are for home and hospital and time limits on those?
Sure. So homeschooling, and this is something we went into a little bit more detail in a previous training. Homeschooling is withdrawing a student from the public school system and taking the responsibility for educating the student as their parent. It requires you to meet state educational standards. It requires you to provide all of the education to your child, and it relieves the district of their obligation to provide a free and appropriate public education, and to do everything but monitor for child find. That obligation does still exist, as it would for a student who was in private school or not yet in school. And so if the district had reason to suspect, they may have an obligation to evaluate or discuss, but they don't have an obligation to provide services. That burden is then on you as a parent. And Leslie can speak a little more to this and has spoken to this in previous trainings, but when the student is transitioning back to school, if the student is transitioning back to school from being homeschooled, they would have to go through the IEP eligibility process again. They would have to have a meeting to request services again, and it wouldn't be a continuation of their previous IEP. It gets complicated. Home and hospital teaching, on the other hand, is a service that is provided to students who are enrolled in the district schools, and it recognizes that sometimes students, potentially because of a disability, maybe not because of a disability, are unable to attend for medical reasons. That process requires medical paperwork to be provided by a doctor that will explain why the student is unable to attend, for what period of time they are unable to attend, and what potentially, explain their medical condition that is causing them to need to be provided these services. That process does not relieve the district of their obligation to provide services to the student including provision of a free and appropriate public education. That process requires the district to provide a teacher, to provide curriculum, and to provide instruction and related services to the student and the IEP continues throughout that time period. The parent isn't responsible for instruction. And then I will let Leslie fill in anything that I may have missed.
So I would add that the regulations do say that there is a time limit of 60 days on home and hospital instruction for students who are in emotional crisis. That timeline can be extended. So it just requires a recertification by a psychiatrist or psychologist if that emotional crisis is continuing. And there is also a need for students who are receiving home and hospital for other reasons, a periodic recertification of the need to continue to receive home and hospital instruction. The regulations also say that that instruction is for a minimum of 6 hours a week. We see that often read as a maximum, but it is possible to obtain more than 6 hours a week. It just, again, has to be based on the individualized needs of the student. And if a student needs more than 6 hours a week, then the student should get more than 6 hours a week. And we also see sometimes districts saying that they don't have to provide related services to students who are on home and hospital, but as Megan just said, related services need to be provided. So, so I hope that answers the question. And if there are additional questions about home and hospital, please put them in the chat box. Tasha, do we have other questions?
No other questions at this moment. We have a viewer who referred that other viewer to, I believe, our handbook, but we don't have any other questions right now.
Okay. I will also take this moment to say that the Division of Early Intervention and Special Education Services at the State Department of Education has a number of very useful technical assistance bulletins. Not the easiest things to find, but we can post the link. If you go to the State Department of Education website, it takes several layers of linking to get to those guidance documents, but there is one about home and hospital. There are a number of guidance documents related to education during the pandemic. There are lots of guidance documents about issues that have nothing to do with the pandemic, and those are good resources for you. It's what goes, there are the documents that go to the districts, to the local school systems, to help them understand how to implement the regulations, how to do what they're supposed to do. And so the more knowledge you have about what's supposed to happen, the easier, it will be for you to walk into an IEP meeting and say, well, wait a minute, this is what's supposed to be happening. So, so I encourage you to take a look at those documents. They're very, very helpful. Other issues you want to raise, Megan, before we end for the evening?
I think we have a question about assessment size, guys. It just came in. Can we ask for any assessments right now to determine present level of progress for future comparison, and also for comparison to see if there has been regression since March?
Leslie, can you take that question? I am putting the link to the technical assistance in the chat.
Sure. Yes, you can certainly ask for assessment. If you're in a district that is not doing any in-person services, they may tell you that there are assessments they cannot do, or that, or they might say that they can do assessments online. There's been some discussion about what assessments are reliable and valid if they're done online. So it really it depends where you are and what assessments you're looking for. In terms of assessments to begin to lay the groundwork for compensatory services, we've generally been feeling it's too early to make an argument for compensatory services or to do an assessment to figure out compensatory services until students are back in school and there's an opportunity to get them settled in and see where they land. There's sometimes that honeymoon period where it looks like kids are doing well and then they settle in and it's not really so good, or it may be really tough for kids at the beginning because they're not used to being in school, and then after a couple of weeks everything's looking okay. So it's really hard right now with students having been out of school for so long to be able to, I think parents have a good sense of what skills their students, their children have lost, but how quickly they may regain skills is not clear. And until kids are back in school and there's been a bit of a chance to see how that unfolds, we would argue that it may, teams may underestimate the entitlement that some kids have, and also they may overestimate in other situations. But we're concerned about underestimating what kids may be entitled to, and also that it may be very difficult to figure out what new or different services may be needed. So it's fine to ask for assessments to figure out present levels, or assessments if your child was overdue for triennial review, or if there's some other compelling reason for an assessment. But you also might want to think about holding up, or at least making the request now, because it may be a little while before it happens. We also know that realistically, we know that there are districts such as Howard that are very backed up. We have heard the number 1,000 for the number of assessments in the backlog in Howard County. We don't really know what's going on in other places. We know that for bilingual assessments in Baltimore City, there's at least some delay. So not really sure how it's panned out in other places, but making that formal request, knowing that it may take a while, might make sense now if you're concerned about getting an assessment done. So any other questions? And thank you.
You mentioned, Leslie, I know you mentioned making a formal request, but another viewer just specifically wanted to know about how to make that request.
Right. So everything flows through the IEP team. And if you are wanting assessments, you would ask for an IEP team meeting and you can say in your IEP meeting request that you want to discuss the need for assessments for your child. And then the team would meet and they would talk about whether they think your child needs the assessments you're requesting. And again, if they say, no, we don't think those assessments are necessary, they have to tell you why they don't think so and what they've relied on in making that decision. And if they agree, they would document that they're requesting those assessments. But every decision about special education, every decision about assessments, about what assessments to do, about what services to provide, about placement, everything flows through the IEP team. So making that request to the team and making that request in writing and keeping a copy of any communication you have with the team is that's the route to take. It's the IEP team.
And I wanna piggyback on that because I saw the commenter had specifically said, do you need to just email the team? And as Leslie said, the best way to do it is through an IEP team decision, and they should document afterwards. But I just want to reiterate, if you make the request at a meeting and you don't get a prior written notice, either of the school's agreement or disagreement with the need to do evaluations, particularly if it's a disagreement with the need to do evaluations, as I mentioned when we were talking before about services, you could and should then put in writing yourself, documenting that you've requested it at an IEP team meeting, so that you have a paper trail, because it's always important, particularly if you don't get notice from the school of a discussion that you had with them, to make sure that you are keeping documentation of it yourself.
And I'm going to just piggyback on that, and say, that there's. So I just want to be clear: if you email the team, to not just email the team and say, I want my child to be assessed, but to email the team and say, I am asking for an IEP team meeting to discuss assessments for my child. The key thing, it has to be the IEP team deciding, and so you need that meeting, because otherwise it's just you're making a request and it doesn't carry the weight that it does. It has to be in front of that actual team, because it's a team decision. So if you write to the team, or the chair of the team, what you're asking for is that meeting, the IEP meeting, at which you would discuss the need for assessment for your child. So I hope that's clear.
So we have a viewer whose family moved to a new county about 6 weeks ago. The child had a one-on-one taken away, and the parent is upset that they made that decision without meeting the child, especially because the child is nonverbal.
So I can start off by saying that when a student, the federal law, COVID or no COVID, says that when a student moves from one district to another district in the same state, or from one state to another state, the team at the receiving school needs to implement the IEP as it was written, until they evaluate the child themselves, formally or informally, and determine what the child's needs are. There has to be some basis under the law for a change in the provision of services. And until there is a basis for the team to make that decision, the law requires them to implement the IEP from their last school district as it is written. So if it doesn't say whether it was done in an IEP meeting or outside of an IEP meeting, but unless there was some basis at that receiving school or receiving district, based on observations, based on your child's needs, and a determination that your child's needs had changed, as opposed to a determination of administrative convenience, or we don't offer that, or something like that, which would not be permissible, then it's not permissible for a receiving district to change an IEP.
This might be a good time to just mention, piggybacking on what Megan said, that it is illegal for a school system to make decisions based on administrative convenience, or the configuration of the service delivery system, or the nature or severity of a child's disability. Those are all factors that cannot be the basis of a decision. So if you hear things like, oh, we never provide one-to-ones for students because we don't want them to become dependent, or we don't do this here, or we don't have this service over at this, everybody who needs this service goes over to that school, that's where the nurse is, or that's where that service is. Those are red flag kinds of statements that those are the things that are being said on the basis of the service delivery system, or administrative convenience, or all the kids with this kind of disability go over here. That's when they're making decisions based on the nature or severity of the disability. So those are all things just to keep in your head, and to know that it's problematic if you're hearing those kinds of things, or decisions are being made that don't seem to be individualized, and taking away a one-to-one. I mean, again, we need to know what the circumstances were, but not meeting your child, not looking, just taking away an aid could potentially be making a decision based on one of those factors. But again, we would need to know the facts, or whoever.
The commenter responded saying that the district said they don't offer one-to-one in their county.
Yeah, so that's a problem. That is a red flag, and you may want to call us or call another source of assistance. But that kind of comment, blanket, we don't do that here, is a problem.
Okay, so no other questions right now.
Okay, well, I know that we are coming up to the end of our hour. So if there are no other questions, we will end for today. We are thinking that we will maybe go to every 2 weeks for these. So we'll likely not be doing this next week, but we'll come back in 2 weeks, and I think that there'll be a lot more information to share with you, and probably a lot more questions as districts are moving forward with their plans. So if a lot of questions come in between now and then through the comment, the chat box, we will convene next week, and we'll certainly send notices out. But otherwise, we'll come back in 2 weeks. So thank you for joining us, and we hope this has been helpful.
And I just want to add thank you to everyone who was asking us questions in the comments. I just added Susana Barrios' contact email in the chat in the comments. And so if you have additional questions, if you need additional technical assistance or specific assistance related to your child, you can reach out to us via Susana, and we can provide you with further information. And thank you all for joining.
Thank you.